Co-housing. Yeah, actually, I don't know if anybody mentioned it, but we actually coined the term, and we were asked by the Danish ministry they gave us 24 hours to come up with an English translation of bofællesskaber. I didn't think bofællesskaber was going to become very popular in the English language, the Danish word, so we came up with co-housing. I should say we spent all night, we had like 35 options, and we finally came up with that word. The Danes would say that they weren't really creating anything new. They were simply stepping back in time and trying to imagine how to consciously create the high-functioning neighborhoods, high-functioning villages that our species once knew. By the way, I hope you like our mics. Somebody mentioned on the way in that we look like Steve Jobs, so I feel like we're rolling out a new product, sort of like a new iPad. But I think it's more important than the iPad, actually, although it might be as timeless as the village from long ago. This happens to be the one I live in. I'm going to, like Steen, I have a few more slides than I have time, so I'm going to whip through the stuff that I don't think is as critical or that I think that others have been talking about, and focus on the pieces that I think are new. But part of my interest in co-housing stemmed from the fact that I grew up in a small town of 350 people, and I know what it looks like when people relate to each other, that fundamentally it's obvious that people know each other, care about each other, and support each other. It's quite in contrast to moving from here to, for example, San Francisco, where I didn't notice that very often, and thereafter wanted to create the small town setting that I knew as a kid in that very bustling urban setting. The notion of making a high-function neighborhood in the city is very doable. We ended up making a co-housing right on the edge of San Francisco thereafter. This happens to be my grandmother, and her last 10 years of life were entirely in bed, but she had 15 neighbors that played a huge role in her well-being, never spent a day in a nursing care or assisted care. That's simply an old-fashioned neighborhood that had everything to do with her quality of life. I'm sure she would have never lived or wanted to live anywhere near as long if she had been in an institution. A recent study came out recently that said 40% of seniors, for example, are living in assisted care that don't belong there. 40% of the seniors living there don't belong there. And there's just an immense amount of statistics that relate the notion that not living in a high-functioning neighborhood leads to infinite number of pathologies, that we have to figure out one agency, one government, one nonprofit, one new business that are constantly trying to mitigate, basic difficulties of living in an estranged community, an estranged neighborhood where people don't know about each other, don't know each other, don't care about each other, and don't support each other. I was in Spain a month ago, and when I got off the plane and was there to introduce senior co-housing, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, the person, when he met me on the plane, he said, "Chuck, we just had a heat wave in this country that killed 12,924 people. Basically, on 2 days. They're mostly seniors that didn't know somebody next door. That's all it takes to survive a heat wave is a damp towel and somebody who gives a damn." And so all these people that had mobilized in one way or another, leaving their elder parents somewhere else, and maybe in a village, but probably in a more urban or suburban setting, and there's just nobody there to take care of them. This notion of a high-functioning town is something that we have to get back to, a high-functioning village, high-functioning neighborhood. France had the same problem recently where they had 15,000 people die in one summer, if you can imagine, in a couple of days. 1,500 in Paris. Again, it's just somebody next door who gives a damn. I happened to write a book recently about very high-functioning small towns in southern France, and 10 days in a row, I was meeting with a vice mayor or a mayor, and each one of these high-functioning towns, the first thing they said to me is, "We had nobody who died in our in our town during that heat wave. So it's very simple metrics that can help you determine. It's terrible when it has to be that drastic and that dramatic, and it doesn't have to be. Those are just the more obvious ones. There's infinite other corrosive activities like watching TV too much, kids that don't have somebody to play with nearby. So anyway, let me whip through these. First and foremost, the notion that we embrace more than any other is having the future residents play, in fact, a very big role in the creation of their neighborhood. That's very in keeping with what traditional villages did when they were established. You know, it was in Melbourne at the Cohousing. It's named Murundaka, which is what the Aborigines locally say. This is the place that we're going to settle, and these are the people who are determining that this is the place that we're going to settle. It's very traditional notion of village making. Personally, I don't think you can do it without the group. I mean, you can have the most talented professionals ever. I've designed personally over 55 co-housing communities with the residents and hundreds of other multifamily housing projects, but if I really want to make a high-functioning neighborhood, I simply have the future residents. Too often, the development is simply a banker, a bureaucrat, and a developer deciding all the things. The fourth component, which I consider infinitely more important than those, are the future residents that, you know, very much focus on the goals, live lighter on the planet, you know, facilitate a sense of community, know each other, make life more convenient, more practical, more interesting, more fun, more economical, more healthy. Those are the typical things that come up over and over again. That 20 or 30 activities they come up with more or less over and over again, then they come up with 100 to 150 activities that serve those goals, you know, meaningful conversations, having dinner together, et cetera, that serve those goals. And then the places, and the thing that surprises me as much as anything else is quite often, well, never have any of these people had extensive common facilities previously that very much supplements their own private houses, but now they do. And now they have that option, and what always surprises me is the long list, 40 or 50 different facilities they need on site, while previously they had none. And that stems from, you know, we spend 4 days on the site plan and a total of 12 days very intensely working with the groups to generate a new village with them. You know, there's so many misnomers about this because, among other things, people think that it must elongate the process considerably. Basically 4 days of design with folks, and we just get it done in 4 days over and over, 55 times now, and it's been no problem. And the funny thing is we happen to have a 70-unit senior housing project for a nonprofit on the table right now as well. And those take months and months and months to get a site plan done. So over and over and over again, we find that the fastest way to get a project done is with the future residents, because we cut to the chase around the needs, wants, and desires, values, true life experiences. I'm a big believer, I'm an architect, but I'm a believer that everybody's got a little bit of architect in them. Look at these folks. I mean, you know, over and over again, 30 or 40 strangers sit down, and we do these in different rooms so that they all generate a single site plan based on the same program. But anyway, it's a very thorough process. Kate and I spent 25 months in Denmark learning from the best of the best of the best in terms of the people that were generating these site plans with the future residents, always with the future residents. There's 4 key components into what co-housing is. It is design and development and organization with the residents, that's 1. 2 is it's designed to facilitate a sense of community over time. 3 is it's extensive, I should say, common facilities. And 4, it's entirely self-managed. So, you know, over and over again, I'm happily surprised to see, even when, you know, there's plenty of land to consume, people get the houses closer together based on the goals that they had put on the table, like, you know, spontaneous socializing. I mean, we all have a community, we have to, or a social animal, but these folks, I happen to live in this one, wanted community to be an easy, natural extension of their day-to-day life. Nothing's forced. It's not based on my automobile, my telephone, and my date book. I can walk out my front door and see and know my neighbors. I can walk out my back door and have as much privacy as I want. That's a constant amongst co-housing site designs, is that you feel like you have as much privacy as you desire and as much community as you desire, which is more complicated in private houses where you pretty much have as much privacy as you want and as much privacy as you want. So I've noticed that the people who get involved with co-housing are people who like choice in their life. Choice is a readily available possibility as opposed to a landscape that is defined too often by a fairly rigid notion about, and a default notion really, about how do we preserve privacy. Privacy is fine, but the other side of it is you can accomplish a great deal if you incorporate a little bit of community. My favorite poem in the English language, does anybody here know what it is? The shortest poem in the English language, the shortest poem? Me, we. And the average interpretation of that poem, the most common interpretation of that poem, is that I can have a better life if we have a better life, basically. And I see that living in this co-housing community day after day. The other reason that, besides turning over all the rocks and coming up with a site plan that they're very proud of, the other main reason that we do this is that they own this thing, not just financially, and they do have some skin in the game there, but especially and most importantly, emotionally, they own the project. They champion it. They champion, 55 projects, and we've only had one, a 56th project, that didn't get approved. And over and over and over again, it's these future residents who champion the project through the city. I have to help them realize what the issues are typically, but I would never have as much luck championing the project as they would. And I set them up. This project was more or less mission impossible. Imagine going to the most expensive neighborhood in Sydney and buying a house there for $1 million or so, and then, or more, whatever it is. 50 million. Okay, maybe not the most expensive. Maybe, was that a condo in Sydney now? Is that right? Yeah. I'm talking US. Okay, never mind. Never mind. Anyway, imagine you go to an expensive neighborhood anyway. It's all relative, real estate. And buying a house, and then getting it rezoned to put 24 houses around it. Brand new houses. It was zoned for single family houses. It's really mission impossible. But they did it. They did it because they were able to explain to the officials that this was in fact the highest and best use. These are people who deserve quality housing too, and they were actually going to be a huge benefit to the neighborhood. In fact, actually, interestingly enough, this is in Oklahoma, not the panacea of progressivism in the USA. And but the biggest problem they've had is that, it's serious tornado country, and we put 3 tornado shelters on this site. So the biggest problem they've had is whenever there's a tornado in the neighborhood, all the neighbors come to visit and want to hang out in the tornado shelter. Anyway, it's been a problem. But they never asked for this. They never asked for something that looks or feels like a single-family house neighborhood. They always ask for something that looks and feels like a village. Again, with the parking to the periphery, easy to use the common house because it's on the way from the parking to the houses. It's all at the periphery there. Easy to use the common house because it really is an extension of the houses, and on the way. So anyway, let me whip through a few of these slides. It usually feels very much like a village when we finish. This happens to be Nelson, British Columbia. And amazingly enough to me, is they always seem to feel like this happens to be an ancient Chinese village. And we always sort of come back to this. They always seem to come back to this. And even though I can kind of predict that it's going to come back to this, again, I would never want to step in and say, this is probably what you're going to end up with. I let it very organically go to that place with the future residents because they own it then. They own it, they champion it, they get it approved, they get it built, they get it financed. And those are all the bigger pieces. People can sit around and design this stuff till the cows come home. But if you don't have somebody there to champion it through all of the institutions that you're going to be dealing with, you haven't accomplished it. Interestingly enough, as I've been traveling around Australia for the last 3 weeks now, and whether it's Melbourne, Hobart, Adelaide, group after group after group has been telling me that, Chuck, we've been at this for like 10 years and we haven't accomplished it yet, or they're just getting it underway. And we usually are, from the time they buy the property to the time they move in, is about 3 years typically. And I attribute that a great deal to the fact that we just watched, the second time we went to Denmark to learn co-housing, we were going to only go for 6 months, but we watched the best of the best, and we realized we didn't know what we were doing until after 13 months, so we were there for a total of 25 months. And we attribute that to just watching these folks, get really good at it. And then, of course, although people have mentioned the books, I haven't been able to find them around Australia. So anyway, I attribute to the skill set that's so critical to helping a group realize their potential over and over again. And anything, if anything I could suggest, it would be somehow, figuring out a way to share that even more. I've decided this week that I'm going to stop being shy about that. Katie, my wife, she has a program called 500 Communities, where she's training project managers, for example, on how to go through. And we have a program in our architecture office where we train architects on how to go through and help groups set them up for success. Ironically, most of the architects who've come to our office to learn how to do co-housing are from Denmark. Isn't that ironic that they're coming to our little office in Little Nevada City, California, up by Lake Tahoe, to learn how to do co-housing and then go back and continue? It has a lot to do with a lot of the architects in Denmark that have been doing co-housing forever are currently retiring, so we have one of those firms that's still doing it. And the whole notion, again, is things like spontaneous socializing. So while these 3 women are about ready to go to the movie, they run into Victoria, and Victoria's texting her husband saying, I'm going to the movie. This seems very straightforward, basically, and very basic. And yet these, as far as I'm concerned, this is more important than any kind of government program that anybody could put together about quality of life and community over time. Privacy, community, common facilities. This lifestyle, again, recreating what used to happen naturally, this might have been what happened in the grocery store before. It's not what happens in the grocery store now. So making a place like where we live, where dinner is on the table 6 nights a week, for example, I have to cook once a month, and everybody cooks once a month. And breaking bread certainly is the most timeless way of stitching a community together and keeping it together. Not just because of the practical notion of solving, the basic goals, making my life easier, more convenient, more practical. Nothing does that more than having somebody else shop, cook, and clean up, by the way. And but mostly because of all the activities that stem from this basic activity of breaking bread. Hey, tomorrow I'm gonna, work in the garden in the morning and on the irrigation system. Do you want to join me? Hey, tomorrow I'm gonna move this lumber pile or whatever, or tomorrow I'm going skiing, or tomorrow I'm gonna take the kids to the zoo. The plethora of activities that stem from this activity is endless, basically. This is just an excuse to get together and figure out the rest of life at so many other levels. The other thing we got from the Danes is very deliberately approaching architecture from an anthropological point of view, always understanding the values of this collection of people, this subculture, and not only who they are, but even more importantly, who they want to be, understanding that very, very carefully, reflecting that as directly as possible. If you only took away one slide tonight, this would be it. We probably met with 50 different working anthropologists in Denmark about how the methodologies used to figure out a society and how this is the methodologies that they were using. We all have a little bit of community in us, for example. We all have a little bit of architect. I think we're all an architect, frankly. And, but getting to those basic kernels of information has to be very deliberate, because if it's random at all, A, won't be accurate, and B, it'll take too much time. So it's a very deliberate process. We have a a mantra in our office, which is if it doesn't work socially, why bother? Well, the only way to get to that is to reflect who these people are, because then we can get to the high-functioning social side of the equation. So, for example, when this group were clear to me from the very beginning, Chuck, we're all about dancing. This is a brand new 33-unit project, very affordable, but they were all about dancing. So on their very first common dinner, May 13th, 2000, I was surprised. I mean, I shouldn't have been, but immediately they moved the tables out of the way. Somebody got a fiddle, and they started dancing. I thought to myself, oh, let's see how this works the next day. But the next day, May 14th, 2000, they moved the tables out of the way and started dancing. So, very much reflecting the subculture. We've done co-housing communities right across the street from each other, and they're always different, frankly. Every project is different, so the challenge is understanding who they are. Again, we're architects, we care a lot about design. Fundamentally, the common house has got to be a place that you love being in. It's a place you feel like being in. You like the feel of that place. The acoustics is right. The lighting is right. I was in a project the other day in Adelaide, and they wanted a common building to work well, but the acoustics, I wanted to be out of there as soon as I was in there. It was just so loud and so much reverberation. So the details are important. Sometimes I feel like the environmentalist of the future is going to be the acoustic engineer, because they make places that we want to be conversed. They make places where neighbors don't hear their other neighbors. I mean, I don't know if this is true in Australia, but in the US, when you have common walls, they still don't want to hear their neighbors. And fundamentally, people spend a great deal of time there. We have about, in our 34-unit co-housing, about 450 people hours a week in the common house. People use it like I use it 4 or 5 or 6 times a day. It's a natural extension of our house. That is what sustains a sense of community. More than anything else, people want to be there, and the food's great. Some days I kind of feel like it's a glorified dining club, but that's okay. Will here, 86 years old, he started this particular co-housing, a different one, because he wanted to live near the in-laws, near the grandkids, near the kids, and very much, again, in a village-like setting, but in the early 21st century notion is I want to live with the kids, but not with the kids. There's a value in proximity, but there's a detriment to too much proximity. So, most co-housing finished in the U.S. now, about 160, are very child-rearing oriented, very family-oriented. These moms would say this is the notion of parents or adults being adults and kids being kids is how we want to, the notion that we want to wrap around these buildings around. The guys, they hang out in the workshop talking about doing things. Never see them do anything. They read catalogs. I don't know if that counts, but I think they bought these offcuts. You can get out by the barrel. The fourth point I want to just reiterate is 100% managed by the residents themselves. Even when we do rental nonprofit projects, we insist that the management is 100% by the residents, and they can do a better job than anybody else. They don't need to be managed. They're very capable, and they're much better at doing it than anybody else. 10 o'clock breakfast in the morning, chasing kids. The family benefit of common dining is real because it takes pressure off of who's cooking tonight, being chased by kids. This project here, 2004 Neighborhood of the Year in the U.S. That year, 1.5 million houses were built. This is 30 houses only. And people, and we were surrounded by 3 other new projects. One took 5 years, one took 5 years, one took 7 years. This one took 3 years. And these other developers were very sage, capable, veteran developers. And not only did this take longer, they got Neighborhood of the Year. Always amazed me that these very seasoned regular developers couldn't imagine, in my opinion, making a place that is in fact this responsive to these real needs, wants, and desires. In fact, actually, I learned about co-housing when I was going to the University of Copenhagen in 1980, there to learn about the language and housing. And it was because I was walking by I was noticing over and over, walking past normal single-family houses, there was no life between the buildings. Normal apartments, there was no life between the buildings. Normal strata, there was no life between the buildings. And then there was this one development that I walked by every day that people were sitting there and talking to each other. People were coming and going from this building where apparently nobody lived, but everybody lived, etc. I learned later it was the common house. And I stopped and asked, and I said, what's going on here exactly? And the woman, in my broken Danish and in her perfect English, she replied that, that her and her husband had grown up in a high-functioning neighborhood. They knew what it was. And they wanted their children to grow up in a high-functioning neighborhood. So they didn't want to take it for chance, and too often when you move into just about any neighborhood, you don't know how long it's going to take to get to your neighbor. Usually it's about 5 years, and by that time they've moved. In other words, it's very hard to stitch together these days. It seems like a high-functioning neighborhood. So, it took me about an hour to feel that, in fact, this is a very conservative notion. They were, in fact, uber responsible. I mean, sometimes people get the wrong idea. These are a bunch of hippies or something, with some nouveau notion. This is, again, just a throwback to the notion that living this part of my life, this component to my quality of life, home, neighborhood, city, is all important, not just the home and the city. In other words, there's the intermediate scales where people know and care about each other that, in fact, make a huge difference. When we were planning Nevada City co-housing, Leah was going on and on about how privacy was so important to her. In our first book, we realized that 80% of the time people were sitting on their front porch in co-housing, or their back porch, they were sitting on the front porch 80% of the time, which is the complete inverse of typical neighborhoods where you don't know your neighbor. Something happens when you know your neighbor. It's all of a sudden you can be there front and center for them, with them, and all the rest. Interestingly enough, she went on and on about privacy. I've never seen her in her backyard. I've only seen her in her front yard. The people become, in my opinion, the most important amenity when it comes to housing, to put it into typical real estate terms, as opposed to, in our case, we have a great swimming pool, and it's fantastic, but this is what end of the day makes this place worth living in such a huge way, including the fact that our common house gets an immense amount of use. People are on the common terrace, especially when we have a new keg. The beer making club has just got a new keg. For some reason, people don't get their emails for a day or two, but when they hear that there's a new keg at 4 o'clock on the common terrace, it's like at the most a half an hour notice is all you need, and everybody's there. Meg here, who's 97, Meg, who's 97, when she first moved in, her kids talked her into moving right next to the parking. And a couple years later, not far from the parking, and a couple years later, she moved to the house the furthest from the parking, 700 feet, 200 meters from the parking. And I stopped and I asked her one day, I said, Meg, why did you do that? I'm just curious. And she says, Chuck, I woke up one day and realized that my relationship with my neighbor is much more important than my relationship with my auto. And that's sort of a shift in approach to quality of life, basically, especially for us Westerners. And she, even at 97, she participates in our work day. She, tools around with water, and she's our best cheerleader. But she feels like she's part of something, no doubt about it. And I'm always amazed by how much work the seniors do, more than everybody else. Neera just turned 88. It's very multi-generational. It's 57 adults and 37 kids. 20 of the 57 are over 55, and just turned 88. So people often ask about the homeowners' dues, and we do have them for sure. We don't have any for gardening because the co-housing group will do all the gardening, no problem about that. The homeowner, I don't know what the strata fees are normally, but the kinds of things we have in our strata fees are quite different than typical strata. For example, everybody gets a birthday cake. So the houses are very energy efficient. This is my house. The natural light, for example, and the solar panels mean that was my energy bill last year, minus $86. That's my favorite slide, by the way. It just becomes part and parcel to this collaborative design in my experience, is that everybody percolates to smart design in the end. It doesn't take very long at all. It becomes part of the culture. And of course, I will suggest things if it isn't percolating to the top, but I appreciate it more when they push things. And I try to push as little as possible because, again, I want them to own it. I want them to champion it through the bank, through the city, through their own household, basically, when it comes to the finances. Over and over again, I find these people wanting to invest in things that they've never had before. For example, we all spent $8,000 a house for 1 kilowatt. That's what made it possible to have that energy bill. None of them had solar panels before, including me. We have all sustainably grown lumber, $2,000 premium per house, none of it clear cut. None of them had that before. That's all stuff that percolated from the group. My job as a technician, thank you. My job as a technician after that point was to implement their ideas. If they didn't come up with these ideas, I might have suggested it, and they may have done it or not done it. In fact, it's a quite wide array of priorities that come up per project because they've got to be things that they champion. My highest heating bill last year was $20, and this week, while I've been gone, we had 5 feet of new snow. So it's pretty cold where I live, but the houses are very energy efficient, mostly because of the envelope being more like a thermos bottle than a coffee pot. They're not passive houses, but they're close. This roof system here, you don't see the windows. That happens to be in a very hot place. For those of you who care a great deal about sustainability, you might know the guy named Bill McKibben, who in the U.S. right now is considered the environmentalist. He's the David Brower of our time. He's the guy who started 350.org and other key environmental movements in the U.S. and trying to do something. And when I called him up and I asked him to write the introduction to our new book, Creating Cohousing, which, by the way, I don't know if you can see this or not, but newsociety.com, that's how you can get a hold of our book. When I called him up and asked him if he could write the introduction, he says, "Sure, Chuck, I'll do that, but not because of all the energy you guys conserve, that's fine, but what really pleases me more than anything else about when I visit co-housing communities, which he's got a couple in his neighborhood, is how much energy they create." And he's really talking about nothing more complicated than this. Neighbors sitting around talking about the issues of the day, getting activated because they are aware, they feel empowered because they have other neighbors and friends who help support them and all the rest. So if I was going to if I was going to move to Sydney or the surrounds and I wanted to move into a co-housing community, I know exactly what I would do because I did it in San Francisco. And is I would just get the book in every bookstore. It's a cultural thing, basically. No professionals are going to champion it any better than what I did when we were trying to get it going on in San Francisco. So I got the book in every bookstore, every library, and then people were coming to me and saying, "This is what we want to do." I mean, the people always ask me, Chuck, is it the bureaucrats? Is it the financiers who are the impediments? No, it's the culture, basically. It's a culture that's been weaned from community for a long time, and we've grown to only know, survival of the fittest and everything on my own and all the rest. And to the extent that we learn that others could make our life easier, more convenient, and certainly been my experience. We share hundreds of things. We have one lawnmower for 34 houses, shared cars, you name it. Whatever makes sense. We only do what makes sense, but we do a lot at that level. And it makes it very easy, as Matt was pointing out, to at least 50% decrease in carbon footprint, for example. And infinitely, we were motivated to move into co-housing because we only wanted to have one kid, for example. That was one of our very first original needs, because we thought, just for ecological reasons, we did not want to have more than one kid. Well, Jesse is a very social kid, and to have moved into a typical single-family house or a single abode of any sort would have been abusive, as far as I could tell. Now she has 36 cousins, and she really depends on them a great deal to give her the emotional support she wants. So I think I'm basically done. No matter how simple the box is, I'm always pleased when co-housers are done. They exude enthusiasm because they made it themselves. I believe in that to a huge extent. And let me see if I can see anything else that's critical here for you guys. This is a Canadian project where they used a covered street like this. This is an eco-village which uses co-housing as a building block too, and that's their common house. This project we won the Human Habitat Award for in 2001 from the UN, the United Nations. When they called me up from London to say that you guys had won the Human Habitat Award this year, I said, well, that's quite a surprise since American had never won it before. It's always somebody from the Philippines or South Africa or similar. And she said, well, you know, the American middle class is pretty much the locus on the planet, and you guys are trying to do something about it. So that was their criteria that year. I also happen to know that Australia and Canada has a very similar footprint per person. So, you know, it is us in the middle class who really can have a big positive influence. This happens to be two co-housing communities next to each other, and then they kept a couple of acres for a farm. You know, farming is very much in the air. You know, a village versus not. But this is the point, you know, this is the whole point, is making a place where, especially in the case of seniors, making a place where growing older is easier, more sustainable, more fun, more interesting. So, thank you guys.